In the summer of 1240, Swedish ships appeared at the mouth of the Neva River. The commanders were confident. They had papal blessing. They had armor. They had numbers. What they didn't have was respect for their enemy. 5 hours later, most of them were dead. The year is 1220. Between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Republic of Novgorod lies a wilderness. Forests so dense that armies disappear. Lakes that freeze solid enough to march cavalry across. Rivers that serve as highways for trade and invasion. The people caught in between Finns, Karelians. Tavastians pay tribute to both sides, or neither. Depending on who's watching. The Swedes call it expansion. The Novgorodians call it defense. History would call it inevitable. But this isn't just about territory. In 1221, Pope Honorius III receives word from the Archbishop of Uppsala. The letter describes barbarians threatening Christianity in Finland. The Pope authorizes a trade embargo. The nationality of these barbarians goes unmentioned in the papal records. 8 years later, the embargo is renewed. This time, it specifically names the Russians. Catholic versus Orthodox. West versus East. But beneath the theology, there's something simpler. Fur. The Karelians control some of the richest fur trapping grounds in northern Europe. Novgorod has held the monopoly on this trade since the mid-12th century. Sweden wants in. The Novgorodian chronicles record the first major clash in 1142. The entry is brief. The Gem, their term for Western Finns, pillaged Novgorodian areas, but were defeated near Ladoga, with 400 casualties. The same year, the chronicle notes, Swedes attacked Novgorodians. No elaboration, no details. Just fact. You don't elaborate when something happens often enough. By 1240, the Swedish kingdom is in chaos. King Johan Sverkersson has been dead for 18 years. The realm is divided between those loyal to the old tribal structures, the Folkens, and those who support centralized royal power. The church backs the king. The Folkens back themselves. It's the perfect time for someone to prove themselves. According to the Novgorod First Chronicle, written in the 14th century about events from 1240, Swedish ships arrive at the Neva River. Exact number unknown. The chronicle says numerous ships. They bring Norwegians, Finns, Tavast may camp at the confluence of these Ora and Neva rivers. The chronicles record that the Swedish commander, identified as Spiridin, sent a message to The message, according to later sources, was simple. If you can, resist us. Prince Alexander Yaroslavich of Novgorod was 19 years old. The young prince faced a choice. Wait for reinforcements from the outlying territories. Gather a larger force. Do the sensible thing, or strike immediately with whoever would follow him. July 15th, 1240. 11 a.m., the Novgorodians hit the Swedish camp from 2 directions. Cavalry smashes into the center. Infantry attacks along the riverbank, targeting the ships. The Swedes got eating, resting, unarmored scramble for weapons. The chronicle lists 6 Novgorodian fighters by name. It describes what each did. One rode directly at the Swedish commander and struck his face with a lance. Another destroyed 3 Swedish ships with a small force. A third fought his way to the Swedish bishop's vessel and killed the commander there. Personal detail means personal pride. These weren't anonymous soldiers. These were men whose families would hear their names for generations. The battle lasted several hours. According to the chronicle, the Swedes suffered heavy losses. The commander Spiridin was killed. Multiple leaders fell. Their bishop was reportedly wounded in the face with a spear. Russian casualties: fewer than 20 men. Here's what makes historians uncomfortable. No Swedish chronicle records the Battle of the Neva. None. The Swedish sources are silent about an entire military expedition. Was it because the expedition was too small to matter? A raid that failed, or because the humiliation was too great to record? Modern scholar Janet Martin wrote in 2007, "The Swedish attack on the Neva River was one of a long series of hostile encounters, not a full-scale campaign timed to take advantage of Russian adversity." In other words, this was just another border clash. Except for one thing. After the Neva, no Swedish forces returned to that region for 16 years. The battle had consequences. Prince Alexander received the epithet Nevsky of the Neva, though not until the 15th century, when chroniclers needed heroes, but the real consequence was psychological. The Swedes learned something at the Neva. The Russians couldn't be surprised. They wouldn't wait for you to be ready, and they would punish arrogance. Silence can be strategic. For 53 years after the Neva, Sweden focused elsewhere. Western Finland. Consolidation. Building castles in territories they already controlled, but they were watching the east. 1293 spring. A Swedish fleet, commanded by Marshal Torkel Knutsen, sails to Karelia. This time, there's no warning message. No challenge. No arrogance. Just ships. Stone. Engineers. The Swedes land at Suomenvenpohja Karelian trading site, controlling access to inland waterways. The location is strategic. Control the bay. Control Western Karelia's trade with the outside world. According to the chronicles, the Swedes established a stronghold under apparently peaceful circumstances. By the time Novgorod realizes what's happening, there's a stone fortress where there used to be a marketplace. The fortress is called Via. March 1294. Novgorodian forces, led by Roman Glebovich, reach Viborya. They bring 6 large tributes. The assault begins on March 30th. And then, the weather changes. The chronicle describes it precisely. A mild and warm wind came from the southwest, which partly melted the ice and broke it. The Novgorodians had crossed the frozen gulf. Their siege equipment was positioned on the ice. Now the ice was breaking. Inside Viborg, the Swedish garrison watched. They had no reserves, no reinforcements coming. Just walls and prayers. The ice saved them. The Novgorodians withdrew. But they weren't finished. In spring, they moved against the Swedish fort at Kexholm, deeper in Karelian territory. They besieged it, starved it. When supplies ran out, the Swedish garrison attempted a breakout. The initial charge succeeded. They broke through the Novgorodian lines. Then the numbers caught up with them. The chronicle is blunt. The garrison was utterly defeated. Sweden had lost Kexholm, but they still held Viborg, and Viborya controlled Western Karelia. By 1295, both sides were exhausted. An informal truce held. Not a treaty, not peace. Just exhaustion. 28 years of intermittent warfare. Raids, counter-raids, burned villages, frozen sieges. By 1323, everyone was tired. The treaty establishes, for the first time, a formal border between Swedish and Novgorodian territory. The border runs from south of Viborya Castle, follows the Sestra and Volchia rivers north, continues to Lake Sea. In the populated south, the line is clear. In the northern wilderness, the border points are vague. 6 border markers described in the treaty have never been definitively identified. The treaty had a clause about escaped Karelians. If our Karelians escape to you, then kill or hang them. If yours escape to us, we will do likewise, so that they shall not cause enmity between us. The people who actually lived on the border, Karelians, Finns, Tavastians, had no say in the treaty. Sweden and Novgorod had already established their areas of control. The treaty just made it official. Eternal peace lasted 5 years. By 1328, Swedish colonists were pushing into northern Austria, clearly on the Novgorodian side of the border. In 1337, Karelians in Karelia rebelled against Novgorod and called for Swedish help. In 1339, after 2 years of fighting, the treaty was renewed, with the same border and the same promises. 1348. King Magnus Eriksson of Sweden makes a demand. He wants Novgorod to recognize papal authority. He wants the Novgorodians to debate as philosophers, Catholic theologians. The losing side, he says, should convert. Archbishop Vasily Kalika of Novgorod consults with the city leaders. Their response is recorded. Since Novgorod received Christianity from Constantinople, the king should send his philosophers there to debate with the Byzantines. It was a polite way of saying, no. Magnus launched a crusade. His forces captured the fortress of Oresequer. The eternal peace had been signed 25 years earlier. They set it ablaze. They baptized the Azorians by force. The Swedes held Oresek for months. They couldn't take Karela. They couldn't push deeper into Novgorodian territory. By 1351, Novgorod had recaptured Oresek. The crusade was over. The border hadn't changed. There's a pattern here. Sweden attacks. Novgorod counterattacks. Sweden builds a fortress. Novgorod besieges it. Treaties are signed. Treaties are broken. Neither side can deliver a knockout blow. Neither side can afford to stop fighting, and the people caught in between just survive. By the late 14th century, the wars were slowing down, not because anyone won, because both powers had bigger problems. Novgorod faced pressure from the Golden Horde to the east. Moscow was rising. The Hanseatic League was squeezing their trade monopolies. Sweden had joined the Kalmar Union, a troubled alliance of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden that spent more time fighting itself than anyone else. Border clashes continued in 1392, in 1411, in 1445. But these were echoes. The real fight had moved elsewhere. In 1478, the Novgorod Republic ceased to exist. Moscow absorbed it, swallowed it, erased its independence. The border between Sweden and Novgorod became the border between Sweden and then between Sweden and Russia. It would shift it. Would blur, it would become a flashpoint for another 5 centuries. But the fundamental conflict remained the same. Who controls the frontier? Who decides where the line is? And what happens to the people who live there? Here's what the textbooks don't tell you. The Swedish Novgorodian wars weren't about religion. Not really. They weren't about crusades. Those came later justifications written by monks who needed to explain why Christian kingdoms fought each other. These wars were about money, fur, fish, trade routes, taxes. Control of the Karelian Isthmus meant control of trade between the Baltic and Lake Ladoga. Control of Lake Ladoga meant access to the Volkhov River. The Volkhov River connected to the Volga. The Volga connected to the Caspian. The Caspian connected to the Silk Road. Whoever controlled eastern Finland controlled a piece of the richest trade network in the medieval world. That's why the wars lasted 200 years. Not because of kings, not because of popes, because of merchants. But there's another thing history forgets. The Finns, the Karelians, the Tavastians. They're in every chronicle, paying tribute to Sweden, paying tribute to not rebelling against both, getting crushed by both. When Sweden and Novgorod signed their peace treaty in 1323, the text mentions the Finnic tribes exactly once, to say they had no say in the treaty. The border split Karelia in two, families on opposite sides. Same language, same culture. One side became Swedish, then Lutheran, then Finnish. The other became Russian, then Orthodox. 10. Soviet. That division from a treaty signed in 1323 still exists. The border between Finland and Russia today runs roughly along the same line drawn 700 years ago. Some wars never really end. They just change names. Military historians study these wars for 3 reasons. First, fortress construction in extreme environments. Viaboria was built on an island in a frozen gulf. The logistics alone were extraordinary. Stone had to be transported across ice. Timber harvested in sub-zero temperatures. Workers kept alive through Baltic winters. The fortress held for over 400 years. Second, the use of terrain as a weapon. At the Neva, Alexander didn't defeat the Swedes with numbers. He defeated them with speed and surprise. At Viboria, the Novgorodians didn't lose because of the fortress. They lost because they positioned their siege equipment on ice. The Swedes learned to build where winter protected them. The Novgorodians learned to attack where winter hurt them less. Third, psychological warfare. The message before the Battle of the Neva, if you can resist us, was meant to intimidate. It had the opposite effect. When you challenge someone publicly, you force them to respond publicly. Alexander couldn't afford to look weak in front of Novgorod's merchant class. They already didn't trust princes. So, he attacked immediately. The challenge created the very outcome it was meant to prevent. There's something strange about these wars. Swedish sources are sparse. The Battle of the Neva, not mentioned. The Siege of Kexholm, barely noted. Even the Third Crusade, supposedly a major campaign, appears in Swedish chronicles as a footnote. Russian sources, by contrast, are detailed. They name commanders, describe tactics, count casualties. Why the difference? One theory. Swedish chronicles were written by monks attached to royal courts. Their job was to glorify Swedish victories. Defeats didn't need recording. Another theory. The Novgorodian chronicles served a different purpose. They were merchant records as much as military ones. Battles affected trade. Trade affected profit. Profit mattered more than pride. But there's a third possibility. What if the Swedish silence was intentional? What if these wars, this entire centuries-long conflict, was an embarrassment? Sweden was supposed to be expanding Christianity, building an empire, civilizing pagans. Instead, they spent 200 years fighting Orthodox Christians over frozen swamps and fur markets. It's hard to call that glorious. In 1240, the Swedes thought they were facing merchants. Novgorod was a trading republic, run by merchant oligarchs. Wealthy, yes, but soft. They were wrong. Novgorod's wealth came from controlling trade routes. And trade routes had to be defended. The merchant class funded armies. Professional ones. The Republic hired Lithuanian princes, known for their military expertise, gave them fiefs on the border, told them, keep the Swedes out. When Sweden built Vyborg, Novgorod didn't panic. They built Oresek. When Sweden sent crusades, Novgorod sent counter-crusades. This wasn't a kingdom defending itself. This was a corporation protecting assets, and corporations are ruthless. The Swedes learned this slowly. First at the Neva, where soft merchants wiped out an expedition. Then at Kexholm, where a Swedish garrison starved rather than surrender. Then, over decades of raids and counter-raids, where neither side gained permanent advantage. By the time the Treaty of Antiborg was signed in 1323, both sides understood. Neither could win. Both could lose. Better to draw a line and pretend it meant something. What did these wars accomplish? Sweden gained western Finland. Slowly. Painfully. Novgorod, later Moscow, kept eastern Karelia. For a while, the border shifted over centuries. Sometimes east, sometimes west. But the fundamental division remained. Today, the Finnish-Russian border follows roughly the same line established in 1323. 700 years multiple empires, 2 world wars, 1 Soviet occupation. The line holds, but there's another legacy. Finland exists, not because Sweden won, not because Russia lost, but because the border conflicts of the medieval period created a distinct region, neither fully Swedish, neither fully Russian. Something in between. The Finns and Karelians paid the price for Swedish and Novgorodian ambitions, divided families, burned villages, forced conversions, but they also learned something. Big powers fight over you. They don't fight for you. That lesson shaped Finnish history. When Russia became the Soviet Union, Finland remembered. When Sweden stayed neutral, Finland understood. Independence isn't given. It's not even won. It's survived. There's one more thing about these wars. One thing that makes military historians uncomfortable. Neither side was right. Sweden claimed they were spreading Christianity. They were. But that wasn't why they came. They came for trade routes, for tribute, for control of resources that would make them rich. Novgorod claimed they were defending Orthodox Christianity. But that wasn't why they fought. They fought to maintain monopolies, to control markets, to keep their merchant oligarchs wealthy. The popes blessed Swedish crusades. The Orthodox Church blessed Novgorodian resistance. But at the end of every battle, the dead were the same. Conscripted peasants, Karelian villagers. Finnish farmers, people who didn't care which direction they prayed. They just wanted to survive the winter. Modern archaeology tells the story the chronicles left out. Burned settlements in western Karelia, dating to the 1290s. No valuables found, everything was looted. Mass burials near Ladoga, from the 1240s. Men, women, children. No differentiation. War doesn't distinguish. In 1445, the last recorded clash between Sweden and Novgorod took place. The chronicles don't give details, probably because there weren't any worth recording. Just another raid, another counter-raid, another few dozen people dead on a border that didn't mean anything to them. 33 years later, Novgorod fell to Moscow. The wars continued. Sweden versus Muscovy. Sweden versus Russia. Sweden versus the Soviet Union. Different names. Same border. Same violence. The Swedish Novgorodian Wars didn't end in 1445. They were just getting started. The Treaty of Entiborg, signed in 1323, established the first formal border between Sweden and Novgorod. That border, with modifications, still divides Finland and Russia today. The Karelian people remain split across this border, a division that began 700 years ago. Between 1150 and 1445, no comprehensive casualty records exist for the Swedish Novgorodian Wars. The conflicts are estimated to have claimed thousands of lives, most of them civilians. Neither Sweden nor Novgorod achieved decisive victory. The wars ended not through conquest, but through exhaustion. In war, truth is the first casualty. In medieval war, the first casualty was always the person who lived on the border.